Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Free Press Live. Slightly different this time. We're doing it in the morning, first of all, slightly early. And we are live in person from the Free Press newsroom in New York. It exists, it's right behind me. As always, I'm Michael Moynihan. And to my left, the great opinion editor of Newsweek. I shouldn't say that, just the great Batya Ungar-Sargon. She does a lot of things. But later on, we're going to be graced the presence of the Free Press editor-in-chief, Bari Weiss, who will join us to interview from the boogie down Bronx, Representative Ritchie Torres, the anti-AOC Democrat, about the American response to yesterday's Iranian attack on Israel. We'll also have Elliot Ackerman, the great writer, here to get into it with us on the Iranian strikes and some detail about the war going on now in southern Lebanon and what comes next. But first, something happened last night. There was a debate. That was probably the last one, but it was the vice presidential debate in Batya Ungar-Sargon. I don't know, it looked like a real debate. It was like a real thing. People were actually talking and there was complete sentences, right?
Totally. Last night, Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, and Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, went head-to-head on topics from climate change to school shootings. And after the last presidential debate was criticized for biased moderation, CBS had agreed that they were not going to live fact check the candidates. But there was this moment where Norah O'Donnell just could not help herself. Here's the clip.
Clarifies for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank you.
Margaret, the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app, where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole, and be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. That is not a person coming in, applying for a green card and waiting for 10 years. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process. We have so much to get to, Senator.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The CBP One app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created, Margaret.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut. We have so much we want to get to. Thank you for explaining the legal process.
The moderator was literally like, I'm speaking,
I'm speaking
It was amazing. It was amazing.
No more context, Jay. We don't like context.
They were having a substantive debate.
Correct.
And they cut their mics.
They did.
So they could keep moderating.
Correct.
Hilarious. Overall, last night, J.D. Vance came across as polished and confident. You can see it even in the issue that was the most challenging for him to talk about, abortion.
I grew up in a working class family in a neighborhood where I knew a lot of young women who had unplanned pregnancies and decided to terminate those pregnancies because they feel like they didn't have any other options. And, you know, one of them is actually very dear to me. And I know she's watching tonight, and I love you. And she told me something a couple years ago that she felt like if she hadn't had that abortion, that it would have destroyed her life because she was in an abusive relationship. And I think that what I take from that as a Republican who proudly wants to protect innocent life in this country, who proudly wants to protect the vulnerable, is that my party, we've got to do so much better of a job at earning the American people's trust back on this issue where they frankly just don't trust us.
Tim Walz started off sounding really nervous, and some of his answers were quite bungled. But the strangest thing was that it at times didn't feel like a debate at all, or at least it felt like a throwback to a different time in debating history. They kept agreeing with each other, going out of their way to find common ground with each other. Here are a few of many examples of that.
Senator Vance and I are that far apart. I'm not opposed to what he's talking about on options.
I actually agree with Tim Walz. We should get out of this idea of housing as a commodity. A lot of what Kamala Harris proposes to do, and some of it, I'll be honest with you, it even sounds pretty good.
Well, I've enjoyed tonight's debate, and I think there was a lot of commonality here.
All right.
I think that was so. I mean, it
was like a primary debate. It was two people from the same party.
Except our primary debates have gotten so contentious, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even
Yeah.
a primary debate. So here's my takeaway. I loved the pursuit of common ground. I loved the idea that they both thought that the way to win the debate was to show the American people, look, I agree with this, I agree with that. Less divides us, even us who are seeking the same office than you may think. I do think that J.D. Vance won big. I think he showed why he's the heir apparent of the MAGA movement.
Yeah.
And he did so well that I found myself just feeling so sorry for Tim Walz, who at times looked so lost. I just felt my heart kind of went out to him.
He was like a lost man from Minnesota
it
who
was
had just
so
wandered
sad.
on stage. No, look, if the idea was to make J.D. Vance, and I agree, that was sort of, to me, like one of those fights that Mike Tyson did right after he got out of prison. They would have these guys just walk up and they were the chump fights to get him in shape. And that was kind of a chump fight. It was a pretty easy one for him in a lot of ways because people forgot that he's a very good debater. He's a very, very smart guy. I disagree with him on so many issues, but you can't take away from him that the guy is a strong writer. He's like, his book is very good. He's a very agile thinker. In the thing, he's very, very quick on his feet. But remember that the entire setup for J.D. Vance from the Harris campaign was that he was a weirdo. Did he come across as a weirdo last night? No, he came across as very smart, polished, understood policy. And I think that if anyone came across a little weird, it might have been Tim Walz because, this whole thing, I mean, it distresses me so much less you, seeing them agree on all these issues. Because what you're seeing is the last gasp of a kind of libertarian influence in the Republican Party. They both agree. I mean, that clip right there, housing is a commodity. It is a commodity, I'm sorry to tell you. But what they're talking about is, the problem with housing is because Wall Street speculators, that is not the problem of housing. Regulation is one of the biggest problems in housing, particularly in cities. But yeah, it is a weird thing for somebody who comes from that older school of politics, and I am an old man now, and I'm watching this stuff and I'm like, wait, what are the things they disagree on besides abortion? I mean, even on guns. I mean, he's saying, I hunt, and he's trying to get, I'm a Second Amendment guy, says the Democratic vice presidential candidate. So look, is it gonna mean anything? Debates tend not to, VP debates really tend not to, but I have kind of a weird suspicion that because Donald Trump is such a train wreck in debates, seeing two people, so many people texting me, it's so nice to see two adults talking about politics. I think it will have an effect that we didn't probably anticipate.
The one area where they agreed the most on, I would say, aside from abortion, which I think Vance handled very well by saying, taking a very humble approach and saying, look, the onus is on me to convince the American people that this approach is correct. And until that happens, we're going to do state by state, which is the Democratic approach. The one area where they had the most amount of disagreement was immigration, an area that, of course, Kamala Harris was appointed border czar, bungled that. We know that there are 15 million people who crossed over the border in the last 4 years. The number of Americans who are foreign-born now, the highest in American history. What J.D. Vance did was incredible. He made a sober and unapologetic defense of having much less immigration on purely economic grounds. That having millions and millions of illegal immigrants in this country undercuts wages, it makes the housing market more unaffordable, it makes education much harder for the most vulnerable American children, and he did this in an unapologetic manner that is going to speak to many, many struggling working class Democratic voters who are sick of being called racist because they want the American dream for their children.
I mean, and contrast that to the one presidential debate when we got cats and dogs. We got the eating of cats and dogs stuff.
They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs.
And by the way, Walz is just not ready for prime time in so many ways. When J.D. Vance says, and I think J.D. Vance is actually wrong about this, that the main driver of real estate costs is immigration. That's not true. It is obviously any number of people coming into a small place where there's a limited supply. It's a supply and demand issue, of course. Walz says that's not true. Okay? So what is true? In Vance's response, he has nothing. He bungles. How can you not be prepared for this stuff? And we cannot not talk about the Tiananmen Square answer. I mean, that was like, those are the moments when I feel bad for somebody that how are you not prepared for this? And he starts off literally by saying, well, one time I was in Minnesota and we were at a hockey game, and it's like, what the fuck is this? Like, you have a direct question. You said you were in Hong Kong during the uprising in Tiananmen. What happened? Long answer. Then I'm a knucklehead. Well, clearly. And then another long answer, and doesn't get to it. Doesn't actually answer the question. How can you not be prepared for that? It's beyond me.
It was so hard to watch. I'm not a fan of Walz's policy, but he seems like a pretty nice guy who sometimes gets carried away when he's talking about things. And to have to answer in that way for something that I think a lot of people do, which is embellish, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. I don't know. It was very, very difficult to watch. It was like when Biden was, forced to sort of answer for being put on the spot in ways that you knew that he was going to fail. I don't know. I found that very difficult to watch.
Yeah, I will just say, as a final note on this, keeping in mind that Tim Walz, the reason for the Tim Walz pick, which I think, by the way, last night looked like a bad pick. I mean, a Shapiro on stage versus a Walz on stage, to me is, I think.
But let's just put the nail on that. The reason that they didn't have Josh Shapiro was because at the beginning of the Harris campaign, they thought they had to cater to,
I was going to raise my hand and say, because he's Jewish.
Exactly, they're far left wing, and that seems to have been a huge miscalculation at this point.
Because the idea was to get somebody who can appeal to men, to working class white men, and that's going to be the guy. And if you're looking at that last night and you say, oh, I think he's the one who's doing the job, I think you are sadly mistaken. All right. Unfortunately, if you have been paying attention to news that is outside of our contiguous borders, you've been seeing what's going on in Israel, with Iran launching a barrage of ballistic missiles on Israel yesterday. Representative Ritchie Torres is here to speak with Bari Weiss about what the American response should be. First, let's take a look at this trailer for our new series, Swing State Debates, in which the Free Press's Ben Kowaler, the very funny Ben Kowaler, moderates conversations around the country about the issues voters are focused on in the upcoming election. Stay tuned.
Has no place in our schools and public education. Our kids aren't even learning how to read, and we're telling them that they've been born in the wrong body.
You look at the LGBTQ community.
There's no such thing as LGBTQ community. There's LGB and there's T and Q.
If we're going to care about all the students, then we need to care about all the students.
These things are just inflammatory, like bright, shiny objects.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Tiffany, I swear.
Then let me say it for her. No, you're wrong.
You're going to personally commit right now that you're going to go find those history books and you're going to make sure that they don't say enslaved people should be grateful.
There were slaves that materially benefited by selling services.
I say that's indoctrination.
You were telling my child that enslavement was slightly beneficial for them. No, it was not.
It's not indoctrination.
Listen, but it's not indoctrination.
Indoctrination means, can I just define indoctrination?
No.
Representative Ritchie Torres, thank you so much for joining me.
Always an honor to be with you.
Well, the news that we obviously have to begin with is what happened yesterday in Israel. Iran launched about 200 ballistic missiles. Some are saying it's the biggest ballistic missile attack in history, sending millions of people to underground bunkers. One person was killed. That person happened to be a Palestinian. And the vice presidential debate last night opened with a question about this issue. What was the question? The moderators asked J.D. Vance and Tim Walz if they would support a preemptive Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. And so I want to start our conversation with that question to you. Would you support, and do you think America should support, and should Congress support, a preemptive Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities?
Look, as far as I'm concerned, Israel has a right to defend itself. America should let Israel defend itself and provide it with whatever resources it needs. I have to be honest with you, I was confounded by the question, the use of the word preemptive. Like, if Israel were to take action against Iran, which it has every right to do, it would not be acting preemptively. It would be acting defensively. It would be acting in response to the largest barrage of ballistic missiles that has ever been unleashed against any nation state. And so I just find that the media has a tendency to portray Israel as the aggressor, and implicit in the depiction of Israel as the aggressor is the delegitimation of Israeli self-defense. So, much of the media coverage has been nauseating.
There's been a kind of tension from this White House about its policy vis-a-vis Israel. On the one hand, you have President Biden declaring in interviews, I'm a Zionist, Israel should defend itself. Of course, they provided billions of dollars in aid. All of those things look like America is defending Israel and, having the special relationship, being its ally. And on the other hand, if you look at the sort of trope out of the White House since October 8th, a lot of it has been, we defend Israel's right to defend itself, but it shouldn't go into Rafah. But we should have a ceasefire. But. How do you understand that? We have a column today in the Free Press by our Eli Lake saying, it seems like America has sort of put handcuffs on Israel, that it's allowing it to fight not for victory, but to a tie. Do you think that's fair?
Look, I've lost faith in the DC foreign policy establishment. Right? The experts in DC said that Israel would never degrade Hamas. Hamas has been degraded. The experts said that Israel would never be able to degrade Hezbollah. Israel's degrading Hezbollah. Like, the experts in DC have been wrong. And I feel like there's a fundamental misunderstanding of deterrence. Every time Israel defends itself, we hear the word escalation. Israel's accused of escalation. And the use of the word escalation, I think, reveals a misunderstanding of deterrence. The nature of deterrence is not to provoke war, it is to prevent it. Right? When you project strength, you're deterring war. When you project weakness, you're inviting more violence and more war. And I think Israel has successfully reestablished deterrence. And so I trust Israel's instincts on this.
The only thing that was standing between millions of Israelis, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and of course also all kinds of other people is Iron Dome. The same thing that protected Israel from the Iranian swarm of rockets and missiles back in April. This seems to me to be almost a miraculous invention, and yet there are people in Congress, both on the left and the right, I'm thinking of Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib on the left, Thomas Massie on the right, that want to defund that project. What do you say to those kinds of people? How do they justify that?
Look, I mean, if we were to disarm, every rocket that's fired at Israel is an attempt at mass murder. And if we were to disarm Israel in the face of aggression from Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and the Islamic Republic of Iran, you're simply creating conditions that would lead to the mass murder of Jews in Israel. And that, to me, is completely unacceptable. I tell people, imagine if the United States were to live in close proximity to the most powerful terrorist organization in the world, Hezbollah. And imagine if the terrorist organization were firing up to 10,000 rockets over the course of a year at American homes and communities, causing the displacement of 100,000 Americans and murdering children, American children. Does anyone think that the United States would wait a year before responding? Like, Israel has shown remarkable restraint in the face of Hezbollah and Iran's aggression, a level of restraint that the United States would never show. And so we have to stop expecting Israel to accept what no other nation state would accept, to accept what every other nation state would deem unacceptable. We have to stop holding Israel to a dangerous and deadly double standard.
There's a level of moral confusion around this topic that confounds me, right? If we go back to September 11th, 2001, and we just imagine a scenario in which on September 12th of that year, New Yorkers, people around the country were marching through city capitals, declaring their love for Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. That would have been absolutely, that would shock the conscious. It would have been, there would have been a national outrage the likes of which we cannot imagine. And yet yesterday, a few days ago, just outside this office, there were a group of people carrying signs, among them one saying, New Yorkers love Hezbollah. New Yorkers love Hezbollah. How do you understand this? And obviously I'm choosing one of hundreds and hundreds of examples just in this city that you represent, but of course I could choose cities across the world. There are people marching a few days ago in Dearborn singing Khaybar Khaybar al Yahud, which is a call for genocide against the Jews. What do you make of this response? How do you understand it? Because a lot of the people that are shouting these things self-identify as political progressives, and I just don't understand when it became a progressive position to support terrorists.
Well, it's a perversion of progressivism, and it's a shock to our conscience. The post-October 7th volcanic eruptions of anti-Semitism on college campuses and on social media platforms, I see it as a civilizational challenge. If we as a society, if we cannot condemn with moral clarity the cold-blooded murder of children and civilians, or if we have Americans cheering and celebrating the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, it means we are in real danger of rotting from within as a society. And so what is transpiring in our country not only affects Israel, it not only affects the Jewish community, it affects all of us. Like, there's a need for a reckoning with the deepening rot of anti-Semitism on college campuses, on social media platforms, and even in the halls of the United States Congress.
Say more about that last part. The halls of the United States Congress.
No, look, I think there are extremes on the far right and the far left that want to sever the U.S.-Israel relationship to the benefit of our foreign adversaries. And I think what we've seen is not only an outbreak of anti-Semitism, but also an outbreak of anti-Americanism. I see the world as a power struggle between the free world, led by the United States, with allies like Israel, and the axis of anti-Americanism, led by the likes of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And there are extremes on the far left and the far right that want the United States to withdraw from international relations, that want to create a power vacuum that's going to be filled by totalitarian regimes like the Chinese Communist Party, which would be to the detriment of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I think that's the core debate that's unfolding in Washington, D.C.
Well, part of that core debate kind of came to a head last week when Senator Bernie Sanders introduced a resolution that would force the Senate to undertake the first ever vote in Congress on blocking weapons transfer to Israel. What do you make of that resolution, and do you think it has legs? Do you see that as part of the problem?
I emphatically reject it. Proposing to disarm Israel as it is facing attacks on 7 fronts is a death sentence for the Jewish state. Like, it is completely unacceptable to me, and we should reject it categorically.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in this city and then get to the new bill.
There's nothing happening in this city.
Nothing at all.
Nothing eventful.
No federal indictment against the mayor, no anti-Semitism.
No
just
CCP
normal.
spies.
Exactly.
No.
Normal day.
Yeah.
Officials at CUNY's Baruch College instructed Jewish students not to attend a Rosh Hashanah celebration, Jewish New Year starts tonight, because their safety from violent anti-Israel protesters couldn't be guaranteed. You spoke out against this. Ultimately, the college backed down. But talk to me about that incident and what it says about the broader explosion of anti-Semitism in this city and how we put a stop to it.
I've been deeply troubled by the anti-Semitism that I've seen in CUNY. I've spoken to Jewish students at CUNY who feel threatened by a pervasive atmosphere of anti-Semitic harassment and intimidation. If you are targeting a Jewish institution like Halal simply for being Jewish, you're engaged in anti-Semitism, right? If you're substituting the word Zionist for Jew in an otherwise anti-Semitic trope or threat, you're not only guilty of anti-Zionism, you're guilty of anti-Semitism. And that's what we're seeing on college campuses. There was an incident in which a violent mob followed Jewish students to a kosher restaurant known as Mr. Broadway. The students were participating in a dinner sponsored by Halal, only to find themselves blockaded by a violent mob, an anti-Israel mob, that was blocking the entrance, slamming the windows, and hurling epithets at Jewish patrons. And I asked myself, imagine if the KKK had harassed black students, or if the members of the Westboro Baptist Church were harassing LGBTQ students, or if white nationalists inspired by the Great Replacement theory were harassing Latino students. Does anyone doubt that there would be anything other than overwhelming outrage from every element of the academic and political establishment? And so why the silence and cowardice and indifference when it comes to the safety of Jewish students? You know, when I speak to Jewish students, what they're seeking is not preferential treatment. They're seeking equal treatment. Like, we as a society should treat the Jewish community with the same empathy and sensitivity that we treat every other minority in our society. And we should treat anti-Semitism with the same seriousness that we treat every other form of hatred in our society.
But do you think the reason that's not happening, and the reason that there's either silence in the face of it, which is frankly the best case scenario, or outright sympathy for the people protesting against the Jewish students eating inside the kosher restaurant, is because a lot of young people have swallowed a morally inverted view of the conflict in which Jews, pro-Israel Jews, the majority of Jews, somehow represent white supremacy, and the Palestinians in the conflict somehow represent in their mind, you know, oppressed black people. In other words, the racial politics of America, or what used to be America, American history, have been projected onto a faraway, complicated place. And that's sort of, in their view of things, that's, you know, you should protest the people that are standing up for, in their view, an apartheid regime. And now you have Ta-Nehisi Coates, by the way, out with a new book saying exactly that. Is that where it's coming from? Like, how do you explain the silence or the sympathy for the protesters?
Well, Maddie Friedman brilliantly describes the phenomenon as the Americanization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, we as Americans tend to apply American ideology where it doesn't belong. But you're exactly right. You know, one of the most influential ideas on college campuses is the idea of intersectionality, which has been weaponized against both the Jewish people and the Jewish state. But there seems to be a worldview that divides the universe into two, oppressor versus oppressed. And in the minds of many in Gen Z, you know, Israel's the oppressor that can do no right. And not only Palestinians, but Hamas is the oppressed that can do no wrong. And that is the distorting, simplistic lens through which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is seen. And we see it even in the media coverage. Like, I have been appalled by the level of Nasrallah hagiography in the media.
It's
Like, the
unbelievable.
Washington Post portrayed Nasrallah as a father figure and a moral compass, and the New York
No,
Times.
it read like a letter of recommendation.
It
I was
was-
like, I want to hire this guy. He seems very devout, very hard
It's
worker.
like I hope that I can get as glowing a eulogy.
You will not.
But the New York Post, I'm sorry, the New York Times portrayed Nasrallah as some kind of like Abrahamic egalitarian, fighting for the equality of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. There are moments when I wonder if I'm losing my mind.
Right. I want to talk about the act that you introduced last week, the No Foreign Gifts Act, which would prohibit gifts from foreign nations that have provided financial support to foreign terrorist organizations. Now, the fact that this even needs to be a law that's passed seems insane to me. Tell me about how this isn't law already, and if and when it will become.
Look, it just strikes me as common sense. Like, my philosophy tends to be common sense. I mean, if you are a foreign adversary of the United States, or if you are a state sponsor of terrorism, like Qatar, which finances Hamas, then you should be prohibited from contributing foreign gifts to institutions of higher learning. You know, it's often said that money is corrupting in politics. It could be every bit as corrupting in academia. We know that the influence of Qatari foreign gifts has had a corrosive and corrupting effect on the integrity of the academic enterprise. And we've seen it not only in higher education, but also K-12.
Well, we
the
did-
Free Press broke the story in Brooklyn.
Yeah, we did a story, our Francesca Block did a story about PS 261, where in I think it was like an elementary school, public school in Brooklyn, there was a map on the wall representing the Middle East, no Israel on the map. The map had been up there forever, and lo and behold, the curriculum was sponsored by the Qatari Foundation.
Yes.
How did that happen? How has that been allowed to penetrate the public schools of New York City?
And when I asked the chancellor about it, he says, I cannot scrutinize every curriculum material. And I'm like, I'm not asking you to scrutinize every curriculum material, only the materials that are coming from Qatar.
Right.
You know, like, there should be heightened scrutiny or an outright prohibition of foreign gifts from from countries like Qatar, which finances terrorist organizations like Hamas and does it unabashedly. And why are we allowing either foreign adversaries or state sponsors of terrorism to weaponize American institutions against America, to effectively wage what I would consider a malicious foreign influence operation through the back door of higher education? It's an act of self-sabotage, national self-sabotage.
I think the other question is, why have we been so easy to buy off? That's like a fundamental, I think, question of political will that we need to be asking ourselves. Okay, I cannot end this without asking you about the political news in New York, which is the federal indictment of Mayor Eric Adams. What do you think of the indictment? Do you think it's legitimate? I'm sure you've read the whole thing. Where does it wind up?
Look, my view is I'm profoundly troubled by the allegations against the mayor. I do wonder if the functioning of city government has been irreparably impaired. But the mayor is entitled to the presumption of innocence. He is entitled to due process, and I would let the process play out. But in America, we have a leadership crisis. And nowhere is the leadership crisis more pronounced than here in New York. Both our mayor and our governor are caught in a downward spiral. And so we need a new generation of leadership because the status quo is fundamentally failing the people of New York.
Well, the obvious question is, are you going to run for mayor?
I'm monitoring the situation carefully.
Very diplomatic.
Can I take the fifth? Yeah.
Ritchie Torres, thank you so much for joining me. I really, really appreciate you making the time.
Always a pleasure.
Up next, we have Elliot Ackerman joining the show to get deeper into what the Iranian attack means for Israel. He's a former Marine, he's a Purple Heart, he's an author, and we're so excited to have him on. Meantime, here's a video on the attacks from last night. Stay tuned.
Whoa, 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 whoa! Whoa!
There are definitely impacts taking place. There was just another wave of ballistic missile attacks, many interceptions over the northern part of Israel.
This is Natan Mintzberg reporting from Tel Aviv in Israel. We've basically just gone through an hour and a half of intense ballistic missiles from Iran. We are hearing of a lot of damage outside on streets and restaurants, residential areas. Iran said that they were only targeting military bases, but this is definitely untrue as we can see a lot of damage in civilian areas. Israelis are used to this situation, but even for us tonight was something on a much, much larger scale, something we've never really seen before.
My name is Yash. I'm a student at Stanford from Atlanta, Georgia, and I subscribe to the Free Press. I'm a Free Press subscriber because I really enjoy thinking about tech and culture, and I feel that the Free Press does a really good job of intertwining both of those two topics. I'd say my favorite writers are Julia Steinberg and Jonas Du. They're both my age, and I think that they add a really good youth perspective to a lot of the issues that are talked about. And they also bring an air of levity to it, so it's not too serious. My favorite article was the piece Julia wrote about effective accelerationism and the rise of AI. The different perspectives she took, both talking about some of the technological implications as well as the societal implications of what AI could mean. I subscribe to the Free Press. You can subscribe too at thefp.com. My name is Yash. Right. I'm a student at Stanford from...
All right, we're back in the Free Press newsroom with the very well-postured now Elliot Ackerman, who is
very decorated.
Very decorated, very well-dressed, and compared to me, not very hard. A author, novelist, contributor to The Atlantic, former Marine. It is embarrassing to read your resume because I feel like a loser.
Sloucher.
Yeah, but the slouching is the only thing that I have against you. Elliot, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, of course.
You've been writing a lot about this, and about a week and a half ago for The Atlantic, you wrote something about Lebanon. Now, the IDF entered Lebanon to almost, no resistance the other day, but we also had, 200 ballistic missiles raining down on Israel. Give us a sense of what you see in the region. You've been a very keen-eyed observer of this for a long time. Where are we at right now? I mean, we hear a lot of this talk about, escalation. It's, it's who's escalating at what point? We can go back to sort of the 1920s, I suppose. Yeah. But where are we at now, and what do you see coming in the next couple of weeks?
I think it's worth going to like first principles, which is Hezbollah has been at war with America, for decades.
Yeah.
And so, in the piece I wrote, I mentioned the fact that when I served in the Marine Corps, my infantry battalion was the 1st Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment, which just by coincidence were the Marines who were at the barracks bombing in 1983. And back in 2006, I was deployed in the region, in the Mediterranean, kind of a routine deployment, and that was when Israel invaded Lebanon before. And that was the first time Marines had gone back into Lebanon because we were evacuating all of the Americans out. So I think, we can look at this from the Israeli perspective, but when we look at the American perspective, it's not like Hezbollah and Iran have been wishing us well these many decades. I also served in Iraq. The Iranians were killing Americans in Iraq. I served in Afghanistan. The Iranian Quds Force was supporting the Taliban in Western Afghanistan, killing Americans. So we as a country have an interest in this. It's not just an abstraction. And now Israel is in very clear, open war with not only Hezbollah, not only Hamas, but Iran. And we seem to be postured, we're kind of scratching our head as their allies. But this is a war that we have a direct interest in the Israelis fighting, and not just fighting it and perpetuating, but winning. And they have an opportunity now to win. And I think we as their allies should just be wholeheartedly behind them. And I think what we've seen too, not only in this Iranian response, after we killed Qasem Soleimani, is their responses have been pretty inadequate. So the question is Iran a paper tiger? And if it is a paper tiger, does Israel have a chance right now to reshape the power structures in the region?
Or should they just take the win? As
Well,
Joe Biden
take the
said,
yeah,
right?
take the win, but look at the Iranian nuclear program.
Yeah.
That is sort of the sword of Damocles that's been hanging over the region now for years. And is this the moment to eliminate that as an ongoing concern? And so I think there's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity not just for Israel, it's an opportunity for the United States.
Why doesn't the United States, though, see it as an opportunity? That's what I can't wrap my mind around. Like, Israel is winning the war. It has the opportunity, as you just said, to reshape the region in a way that would be tremendous for America and the free world. What is it about the Jake Sullivans and the Tony Blinkens, and we can name many other people, that can't sort of allow changing facts to change their minds?
What I have been craving for a long time from American leadership is for our leaders to connect the dots for us, because I think the dots are very clear. You have obviously what the Iranians are doing, but I was in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and in Ukraine, the drones that are being flown by the Russians against the Ukrainians are Shahed drones that the Iranians are sending into Ukraine. So those are allies. There's an axis between Russia and against Iran. There's also the involvement of China in this equation, and because we're talking about nuclear weapons, the involvement of North Korea. Like, we need, as the West, leaders that can articulate a strategy about how to counter this rising authoritarian access and how to allow both the Israelis and the Ukrainians to win. Like, why don't they have the right to win the wars that they are fighting? Why is it a continual conversation about, ceasefire, de-escalation? And what I'm seeing is that those conversations, and we saw this early on in Ukraine, we are seeing it right now in Israel, they prolong the war, they destabilize the region. Weakness is a provocation. Strength is oftentimes, and I would say in this case, certainly the quickest pathway to peace. If you want peace, win.
First of all, thank you for your service to this country. And so
Thanks.
Please accept these remarks humbly, because I have not made the sacrifices that you have or seen things from the perspective that you have. But I wonder if, the way that the narrative is shaping up, it's sort of like there's this left-wing perspective based on, I think, what we all agree is a kind of gross worship of weakness that I don't like that either, that, we should be de-escalating, and that is how, we protect our interests.
Sure.
And then there's the more sort of neoconservative view that the U.S. should be sort of supporting Israel to do whatever it needs to do, thinks it needs to do, which is getting coded by the left as escalation. But I'm wondering if there's another way to think about this. I mean, without going down the sort of very silly, Iran loves America and there's, but is there another way to think about this that, because our interests are aligned with Israel's, because Israel is our greatest ally in the region, that American interests and Israeli interests are not necessarily aligned in trying to see Iran in the most belligerent way possible. I think there's a real misunderstanding of Bibi Netanyahu, who is himself a very risk-averse leader. He's seen as a warmonger, but in fact, he hesitates a lot. It's very hard for him to take decisions that will imperil the lives, not just of Israeli citizens, but of Israeli soldiers, which I think he sees very much as citizens. So, the view that he's sort of pushing for war and it's Biden who's holding him back and thus hurting Israel. I mean, what if it is the case that escalation is not in both Israel's interests and America's interests, that Iran does seem to have been satisfied with this flurry of very terrifying rockets, but rockets that did not actually kill anybody, did minimum damage, were a very slight escalation over what we saw in April. It was an escalation, but certainly not to the extent that Iran was capable of. And that, there is a limited way for Israel to respond that is serious, that is morally serious, that is militarily serious, but that sort of puts a cap on this moment and thus pursues both Israel's interests and America's interests for people who don't want to see the region blow up.
First of all, I think, escalation just for the sake of escalation is not a strategy. So, I mean, first principles in a war is there needs to be a clear articulation of what is victory. When I look at Israel, I think that case can probably be made more clearly. What is victory for Israel? It's the fact that the security of the Israeli state is assured, that you're not going to ever see another October 7th, or at least their posture has been reset. And probably at this point, a central component of that is crippling Iran and crippling the potential that Iran can have a nuclear weapon. So if I were sitting in Netanyahu's shoes right now, I mean, that's what I would be playing for. I'd be like, Hezbollah is crippled, Hamas is crippled, the physical security of Israel is assured, and the Iranian nuclear program is not in a posture where within 2 weeks they can have enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon. If I'm Netanyahu, I feel like that's probably a pretty good list of objectives, and I set out to achieve those objectives. Objectives achieved, then I negotiate the peace. I think in the case of Ukraine, sadly, the objectives to end that war have become sort of fuzzier because, if the objective is to push Russia back to the pre-February 2022 borders of Ukraine, I don't know if that's objective that the Ukrainians can achieve at this point. I think there was an argument to be made probably 6 months into that war that maybe that was possible as the Russians were on their heels. But we as Americans adopted this strategy of, we don't want to cross Russia's red lines. We're constantly taking them at their word, and our sort of equivocation turned into a missed opportunity. But I think one of the things too, when I look at this from an American perspective, that's so tragic for our allies, is these issues, which are American issues, our national security as it relates to these two conflicts, they come here and they get filtered into our partisan lens, right?
Yeah, Israel's the right-wing war and Ukraine's
it's
the left-wing war.
And so you
Why?
can't have a comprehensive strategy between the two. And our adversaries, that completely plays to what they want because it's the oldest military strategy in the book: divide and conquer.
But Batya, as a right-wing populist whisperer,
Sure.
Why is that? Why do you think? Why is Ukraine coded left and Israel coded right?
I'm so glad we're talking about this because I read your piece. I really liked it, but I really resist comparing these two conflicts. The first reason I resist it is because in the minds of the American people, these are not similar conflicts. So your average normie American really wants us to back Israel and really does not want us supporting the war in Ukraine. Now, you could disagree with that. You have a lot of expertise. But in my view, a democracy should reflect what the majority of its citizens want. And average working class Americans are just not interested in funding the war in Ukraine. And furthermore, so I would say, first of all, the right-wing position here is rooted very much in the will of the people and the American electorate. So it's sort of, the
But is
bias
it,
is in that direction.
because leaders, as Elliot sort of has suggested, have not done a good job of telling the story of how these conflicts are linked?
Well, I don't know. So let me explain. I think no. I think it's not because of that.
Okay.
I think it's because they have a natural affinity for Israel, which they view as fighting our enemies. I think that there is just this view that, Russia is not necessarily an enemy of the U.S. Russia was ambivalent. It could have gone either way. It was sort of waffling, China or America. And there were decisions that were made by American politicians to sort of push, to push on Russia's sort of red lines and boundaries in a way that we would never have accepted. So I just keep thinking to myself, can you imagine if Hamas, in the 3 months leading up to October 7th, had amassed all of its terrorists on the Israeli border and stood there sort of saber rattling in the way that Putin did, with a very clear ask, and that ask was a ratification of the status quo, that Israel would not join NATO, Ukraine would not join NATO, that the Donbass would be recognized as independent, which it was at the time, and Crimea be recognized as part of Russia, which it was at the time, right? We would not be having this conversation. October 7th would have looked very, very different, right? The whole idea that these conflicts are sort of progressing along the same route, the same avenue, I think is wrong because of the ways in which the role we played as Americans, and I think undermining our own interests. Can you imagine what Russia would have been like as an ally against China as opposed to an ally of China, which was something that was in our grasp? So I would love to hear you respond to that, because to me it seems like where your average American is at is very much reflected in the reality on the ground in terms of what an America First foreign policy would really look like.
Yeah, well, I think when you look at these conflicts and when you look at Putin's behaviors over the past 20-odd years, and in his own writings, he ideologically very much has this desire to see Russia restored to what it once was, particularly under the Soviet Union. And part of that restoration is a territorial expansion that doesn't respect the borders of countries like Ukraine. Now, I totally understand what you're saying, and I think there are a lot of analogies that you can look back to, the 30s and into the 1940s, as sort of war was brewing in Europe. I mean, people forget, like Lend-Lease, for instance. Lend-Lease was a program that FDR, that's when we supported our British allies, and they were already at war with Germany. That FDR could barely get through the Congress because the United States was very, very divided about whether or not we should get involved in another European war after the First World War. I mean, and then obviously we know the story. Pearl Harbor happened, and the country united around this idea, and the war happened. So I think we are at one of these sort of pregnant points right now where we're looking at the actions of countries that historically do not like the United States or antagonistic to the United States. And we're trying to project out, okay, when is the moment where we have to engage in Lend-Lease? When is the moment where they have gone so far that it can't be ignored anymore? And I think in a country like Ukraine, I mean, that's the debate as it's been playing out since 2022. And I think, when I look at these conflicts, I see dots connecting with adversaries who resent the world order as it exists, post-Second World War and certainly post-Cold War, and want to change that world order. And those nations are authoritarian, and they're acting in concert with one another. But our leaders have not been articulating that worldview to most Americans, and I think, at least in a cohesive way, and I think it's sort of obvious that there's confusion among the electorate. Like, everybody doesn't agree on this. There haven't been strong voices telling that story. That's the story that I see. And I think if Putin was given the chance, he would march all the way to Western Ukraine and Lviv and wouldn't stop there, and he would pick up a lot of these former Soviet republics as well. I think he'd be delighted to do that. That would destabilize NATO, and I don't think that war would end anytime quickly. I think if he did that and saw that the West, was relatively feckless in its response, I think that would embolden China. Xi has been very clear in his intentions to take back Taiwan. That would significantly change power dynamics in that region, and we're already seeing that in the South China Sea with the Philippines. So these are all connected. These are the intentions of what these autocrats are saying. I mean, they say it in their public remarks, what their ambitions are. The only thing keeping those ambitions in check are the potential response of the West. And a world in which Putin is expanding with very few checks on his power into Europe, a world where China insists that the entire South China Sea, which is basically the size of the entire Gulf of Mexico, are China's territorial waters. That's Xi's position. So that's not a world that I think any of us want to live in as Americans. So the question becomes, what's our strategy to counter that world? And I think there can be a robust debate as to how, I don't think that means you go invade and march on Tehran, but I think it means where there are conflicts, where there's the potential to win and clear objectives, we should be supporting our allies and helping them win. We didn't do that in Ukraine, and I think there was a massive missed opportunity after the invasion. I hope we start doing that more clearly in Israel.
And just to point out that the Russians have effectively lost the war in Ukraine. I think it's reasonable to say that when you consider the number of casualties. I mean, what effectively one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union was the invasion of Afghanistan. The number of people that died in the invasion of Afghanistan was, 17,000, 18,000. And we're thinking it's over six figures at this point. They tried to take Kiev and couldn't do it. They've held on to Donbass and Crimea, which, by the way, they took by force initially. It's important to point out. But I want to ask you a final question before we let you go. With your military background, in how you see this militarily. This morning, the Jerusalem Post had a piece from two senior IDF officials talking to the journalist and said, we're absolutely stunned by how little resistance we've gotten from Hezbollah and how much the decapitation of Nasrallah, the walkie-talkie and beeper attacks have absolutely created panic. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me is you see people being taken out in Tehran. You see people being taken out in Beirut. We've seen all the way back to Mugnia, all the way back to 1973 in Operation Wrath of God, and people being killed after Black September. There hasn't been this, World War III response. They really seem to know what they're doing here. They've marched up into southern Lebanon with the anticipation that maybe on October 7th, coming from the north was about to happen. They seem to be just holding that territory. Do you expect a military response beyond the 200 ballistic missiles that were, I have to say, pretty ably handled by Iron Dome? I mean, what is the military future like in the next month or so? I mean, I see, ceasefire now. On what terms? What's happening? What do you expect will happen both in Gaza at this point, we've taken our eye off that, and in southern Lebanon?
I'll offer what I think is the prudent thing for Israel to do. We can talk about like the spheres through which militaries maneuver, right?
Yeah.
Sea, air, land. People forget there's a fourth sphere that militaries maneuver through. It's time. Like, time matters. And so, we saw this in Ukraine, right? The Russian invasion, the Russian army was going to invade. This is the Soviet army. I mean, they're so built up in our minds, and massive underperformance.
Yeah.
Everyone thought Ukraine was toast, and they overperformed. The Russians underperformed. Well, then what did we do? How did Ukraine and how did its allies exploit that? We didn't. We allowed time to pass. Israel has an incredible opportunity right now because similarly, it would appear Iran has been shown to be a paper tiger. So there's an opportunity. Now, in 6 months, will that opportunity still exist? Likely not. So if I were Netanyahu, I would understand I've got a window right now to do something very, very significant in the region, and I have to act decisively. I have to move towards, if the objectives I laid out are his objectives, I need to move to those objectives as fast as I can, as decisively as I can, because that is victory, and on the other side of victory is peace. But there's this idea, if you were to go in, if you found out you had cancer, right, and you go in to have surgery to remove your cancer, would you like a surgeon who's like, listen, we're going to cut you, and it's going to be really slow, we're going to be really gentle, we're just going to go around here, and if you have an ouchie, we'll stop, and then you go in the other room.
Choose that, actually.
Yeah. No.
Don't like ouchies.
Yeah, don't like the ouchie. No.
That's why I'm not in the military and you are.
And if you feel upset about it, you can take a minute, and no. You don't want a gentle surgeon. You want someone who's going to like this. We're going to cut you open. We're going to reach in there. We're going to rip it out, and it's going to be gone. And then we're going to sew you up, You know, you'll take some deep breaths, and you'll be like, no gentle surgeons in war. Go in, execute the surgery, and be done.
I mean, that has been the kind of Israeli perspective for a long time, particularly in Lebanon. I mean, obviously, of the 1983 and then the second Lebanon war in 2006. But it has been kind of a drip, drip, drip. I mean, Nasrallah's been around for 30 years. Was it just last week?
I think
they said, we can actually get rid of him.
I mean, we're seeing an
operation.
operation.
Is the cancer being cut out right now?
Yeah, we're seeing an operation play out. I mean, you see the you saw the pagers went off. I mean, you saw the assassination of Nasrallah. I mean, you're seeing an operation, the steps of the operation. I don't think we're done with that operation yet, but I think they're moving down a pathway. And I think we, again, as their allies, what's our job in this? Our job isn't to, I think at this point say ceasefire, ceasefire. I think our job is to say, okay, this is happening. Yeah. They're our ally. They're moving towards objectives that are in our interests because Iran is a cancer on our society too. And now's the time to get behind our ally. It's not the time to be like, guys, there's an ouchie, stop the surgery. You know what I mean? Just finish the surgery.
I don't like the ouchies. Elliot Ackerman, by his books, he's got about 30,000. How many books do you have?
30,000.
30,000. Just choose one. They're all good. I mean, you just heard him. They're all good. All right, we're going to move on to our final segment now, which is something a little more fun. It allows me to yell about people that I don't like. But first, can you please subscribe to the Free Press? We need your cash. Barry needs to pay me. I do. I'm very expensive. And here, by the way, I mean, it's been very tough. But here is someone who does subscribe to the Free Press.
I'm Courtney. I'm a nurse practitioner. I am a Free Press subscriber. I am in Alameda, California. The Free Press represents to me independence of thought. I like the safe space that it provides for readers. I do not always agree with the articles I read at the Free Press. And I know as a subscriber that that's okay, that that's the point. And I love that. I do feel a sense of community as a subscriber. I feel like it's a little bit of a family that's growing. I think if I could follow around one of the reporters, it would be Olivia Reingold. All the stuff that she puts out is so interesting and off the wall. And I want to follow her around for like a month and just be at her side and be part of it. I definitely have a favorite article, the piece that Bari wrote for the University of Austin. It's called The New Founders America Needs. And I go back to that. I love that piece. I subscribe to the Free Press, and you can subscribe too at thefp.com.
All right. Well, I told you 30 seconds ago that this was a fun segment, and it's the people that I can complain about. But Batya's here too. She's got some complaints too. So we're going to talk about the bad takes of the week. Good Lord, is this the hardest thing in the world to try to decide? I have a Twitter feed that I don't post very much, but it's just really clogged with bad takes. Batya, did you find a bad take this week? I bet you did.
I did find a bad take.
What was the bad take?
I found a bad take. My bad take of the week is the New York Times editorial board's endorsement of Kamala Harris for president. And what I want to do is read a little bit to you guys.
This surprised you?
Because I was not surprised that they just read some of these segments to you of their endorsement of Kamala Harris. All right, so they start out by going, "It is hard to imagine a candidate more unworthy to serve as president of the United States than Donald Trump. He has proved himself morally unfit for an office that asks its occupant to put the good of the nation above self-interest." Wrong.
You disagree with that?
Wrong. If Donald Trump put his own interests first, he could literally drop out of the race and all of the lawfare against him and all of the attacks would disappear. His entire life right now is running for office and putting the good of the country ahead of his own personal self-interest. They go on to say, he has proved himself temperamentally unfit for a role that requires the very qualities, wisdom, honesty, empathy, courage, restraint, humility, discipline, that he most lacks. And my response to that is, because Kamala Harris is known for her wisdom, for her honesty, for her discipline, and for her humility. They go on to say most presidential elections are at their core about two different visions of America that emerge from competing policies and principles. This one, however, is about something more fundamental. It's about whether we invite into the highest office in the land a man who has revealed unmistakably that he will degrade the values, defy the norms, and dismantle the institutions that have made our country strong. Wrong. This election is about two visions of America and how to help the working class achieve the American dreams, and it is about the institutions degrading themselves. They go on to say that Kamala Harris may not be the perfect candidate for every voter, especially those who are frustrated and angry about our government's failures to fix what's broken, from our immigration system to public schools to housing
amazing.
Costs to gun violence. Yet we urge Americans to contrast Ms. Harris's record with her opponents. Wrong. These are Kamala Harris's failures. They're literally telling you,
it's an amazing statement.
vote for Kamala Harris because you are frustrated with Kamala Harris's record. The New York Times goes on, while character is enormously important, policies matter. Many Americans remain deeply concerned about their prospects and their children's in an unstable, unforgiving world. For them, Ms. Harris is clearly the better choice. She has committed to using the power of her office to help Americans better afford the things they need, to make it easier to own a home, to support small businesses, and to help workers. Mr. Trump's economic policies are more tax cuts, which would benefit mostly the wealthy, and more tariffs, which would make prices even more unmanageable for the poor and middle class. Wrong. Kamala Harris is the reason people can't afford anything. She's literally the vice president right now and cast the deciding vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the main reason inflation is so high right now. And meanwhile, Trump has put out a full-fledged economic policy that is designed to help working class Americans, whether they're in the service industry, whether they are blue-collar workers, whether they're seniors. Tariffs, we know, don't impact the prices of things. Just look at the price of steel and aluminum. They talk about how Ms. Harris would work to maintain and strengthen the alliances with like-minded nations. Wrong. Trump oversaw the most peaceful 4 years in American history, and Kamala Harris is now overseeing two massive wars on two fronts. They talk about, as for immigration, a huge, largely unsolved issue, the former president continues to demonize and dehumanize immigrants, while Ms. Harris at least offers hope for a compromise. Wrong. Kamala Harris is the border czar right now. It goes on and on and on. And of course, they end by saying, unless American voters stand up to him, Mr. Trump will have the power to do profound and lasting harm to our democracy. Oh, harm to our democracy, you mean like trying to imprison a political opponent, which they accuse Donald Trump of doing, but actually Joe Biden is doing. Harming democracy, like doing a coup against a person who got 14 million votes, Joe Biden, getting rid of him because you think he's not going to win. Oh, sorry, no, that was the Democrats. And of course, when they say that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, what they mean is he is a threat to the economic interests and the power of the elites. Wrong, New York Times, as usual. What's your worst take?
I gotta say that had I heard that, and I love you, Batya, and I'm happy to sit next to you, I would have said that the worst take of the week is you saying that tariffs don't increase prices, which is the most insane thing of the week that I've heard, and it came from my left. All right, my take. I was watching this live, ladies and gentlemen. I was watching CNN because in situations like what's happening in Israel and Iran, you do just have this old habit to turn on news channels and get some news. There's a bad take out there that I always expect from one Christiane Amanpour on CNN, who's the doyen of foreign policy, apparently. And this is what she had to say about Iran's missile barrage against Israel.
Iranian foreign minister told me in New York during the United Nations that they were showing, and this is again before Friday's assassination, that they were showing restraint, and that Hezbollah was showing restraint as well, and that it wanted, to de-escalate all of this. That was the word also from the podium at the United Nations by the Iranian president. And they were saying that they are being entrapped, and they're trying to resist the notion of being trapped into this war.
I mean, it actually gets worse than that, but I don't even know. I mean, I can keep this one brief because this is my favorite. What the Iranians said on the podium at United Nations is something we should just say, yeah, we take your word for it. Right. You just want, because what typically happens when people show restraint and they don't want to, quote unquote, escalate things, is they typically don't involve themselves in wars that they actually themselves didn't start. I mean, again, this is a very long war. I mean, Hezbollah was started around 1982, 1983, and as our previous guest, Elliot Ackerman, points out, the blood of hundreds of Americans on its hands, and the blood of Jews from around the world blowing up community centers in Argentina just because they're Jews there. This is what Hezbollah and Iran have done. And this idea that these are just peaceful people who are desperate to not, ratchet it up. This stuff is, I can't believe that people actually think this. I have heard this. Now, I will say one thing. Those of you out there who say, this is not our war, I get that sentiment. And that's a sentiment, by the way, I wish people have about everything. They should always think that. On the Lebanon front, I mean, this is an organization that has been at war quite vocally, and Iran too, with America since the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979. So that, this idea that this is just a far-off conflict and that, the Israelis are escalating, I don't even, it's almost as if I just wanted to play that clip for you, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't need to say anything, because what needs to be added to somebody saying that Hezbollah and Iran, they're just I really don't want to ratchet things up here. That is, well, too bad, because R.I.P. Hassan Nasrallah, because you ratcheted it up, and this is what happens. Can I swear on the show? Megyn Kelly swears on the show. You fucked around and you found out. So, all right, that is our show for today. And thank you for joining us. This is our new format. We're going to be back next week in a similar situation with the teeming office behind us and Batya to my left, and in the morning when I'm a complete zombie. But we'll be back with more amazing analysis in the hottest of hot takes, Batya.
Indeed, indeed. And to make sure that you don't miss anything, subscribe right now to thefp.com. And to play us out, here are a few words from one of our subscribers.
My name is Magnus Toren. I am currently the director of the Henry Miller Memorial Library in Big Sur, and I am a subscriber to the Free Press. All of media has now suddenly been just put into this big cauldron, and as we speak now, it's being stirred. It is really tough to keep up with what's going on in the world through all of the different sources. I feel the editorial decisions and ambition of the Free Press is something I generally agree with.
What we call our house, the barn, located at the edge of the wild here.
And, I became a fan of Bari Weiss's, and she's proven that being a fan of hers was not misguided. And I became a subscriber, just like you can, by going on the fp.com website.